Hello, fellow Earthlings. I'm Megan Alexis, and welcome back to Will to Folly, where for some statistically improbable reason, whether random or due to some greater meaningful reason, we're here together at this exact time for this exact moment. So while we're here together, I want to spend a little bit of time answering the question that I think is really interesting. Why is it that intelligent people sometimes become especially good at defending irrational beliefs? I think this is a good question to ask because we all kind of operate through this comforting assumption that we have about intelligence. We imagine that the smarter a person is, the less susceptible they should be to bad reasoning. Smarter people should be able to spot all the contradictions. They should recognize when evidence is weak or, when someone is clearly cherry picking information because it supports, what they already believe. And often they do, okay? So this is not to say that that's not the case, but the problem is that intelligence doesn't determine what the mind or ego is trying to accomplish. A very capable mind can use its abilities to search for truth, but it can also use its exact same abilities to protect its own ego, to defend an identity, justify a desire, preserve a relationship, avoid sounding, dumb or admitting something humiliating. Being good at reasoning does not guarantee that truth is a thing that you are reasoning toward. We like to imagine reason as sort of like this impartial judge that is just calmly and objectively reviewing evidence before issuing a definitive conclusion. However, it's actually more like an attorney, right? So reason oftentimes is like this attorney that who receives the conclusion first and then works backwards looking for evidence. Psychologists have this term, they've coined this term called motivated reasoning. It overlaps a little bit with confirmation bias, so it might sound the same, but they're a little bit different. They're not the same thing. Confirmation bias, if you don't know, it describes our tendency to favor information that supports what we already believe, whereas motivated reasoning gets at this larger problem. Sometimes the conclusion itself is psychologically useful to us, so that's where our reasoning starts working in its service. So maybe the belief is something that protects whatever identity we have formed for ourselves. It keeps us loyal to a person, people, or group, or saves us from acknowledging something that we really don't want to. So let's say, for instance, to help delineate these two different concepts, let's say you're someone that believes that your wife or husband or partner, whatever, is trustworthy. And then something happens that makes you question that belief. Confirmation bias might make you focus on every reassuring detail and discount, whatever you find that runs counter to that belief. Motivated reasoning is this larger process. If believing the person preserves a relationship you desperately want to keep, you now have a psychological reason for the evidence to come out a certain way. So confirmation bias, remember, it describes how you favor the evidence. Motivated reasoning helps explain why one conclusion is much more attractive to begin with. Okay? That doesn't mean that every belief is just secretly or covertly irrational, or that nobody ever follows evidence wherever it leads. It just means that the mind has, or the ego has, motives other than accuracy. And just because someone has a high IQ doesn't mean that they are more likely to think and argue rationally or, objectively. As a matter of fact, intelligence can occasionally make the problem worse. So let's think about this for a second. If I desperately want to believe something and I'm not smart, I have a low IQ, therefore I'm terrible at reasoning, maybe I can produce 2 shitty arguments for it. However, if I desperately want to believe something and I'm extremely shrewd and clever and I have a high IQ, I might be able to come up with 30, not shitty reasons, but good, defendable reasons to support this belief. Because if I'm smart, I can anticipate objections and find exceptions and reinterpret contradictory evidence. I would, in that situation, distinguish my situation somehow from every superficially similar situation, or be able to construe or construct elaborate explanations for why information that would normally count against my position somehow strengthens it. So, given sufficient intelligence and motivation, you can build a pretty convincing case for almost anything. And this is why intelligence and rationality are not interchangeable. They're distinctly different things. Intelligence includes things like how quickly someone's able to learn, pattern recognition, how well you solve problems, especially novel problems or puzzles that you've never seen before. It includes how well you're able to manipulate and work with complex information in your working memory, understand abstractions, utilize verbal reasoning. So language is a big part of it too. Rationality is slightly different. It's like, are you using those abilities in a way that helps you form beliefs that correspond reasonably well to reality? Key word. So those abilities obviously overlap, but they're not identical. You can be extraordinarily intelligent and still have enormous blind spots wherever your own ego is involved or where you've invested heavily. Maybe you're great at picking apart someone else's argument in a situation, but then when that exact same flaw or flaws shows up in your own 10 seconds later because you're in a debate, somehow you totally miss it. Part of the reason we can spot a flaw so easily in someone else's thinking and miss it in our very own is that we have, like I said or alluded to, a lot more invested in our own beliefs, right? They're connected to who we are as people. They're connected to not just our identities, but our entire social circles, our relationships, our politics, our work, where we, go to school perhaps, the people that we respect, decisions we've made, and things we've said or defended in the past. So there's a lot of baggage that comes with that we carry, with our deeply held beliefs. So changing your mind then about something, it means having to reconsider a bunch of other things, all these other factors along with it. So if you've publicly defended a political position, for instance, say for 15 years, because, you've argued about it with everybody around you, friends, family, random people on the internet, you've voted according to it and been, encouraging of others to follow suit. You've maybe been harsh on other people or judged them harshly or critically because they disagreed, or you've lost relationships over this belief. At that point, contradictory evidence is no longer just merely contradictory evidence. It holds serious weight because accepting it, you have to like go backwards and reconsider everything, whether it's previous arguments, judgments, alliances, decisions you've made. That is much more psychologically costly than just like learning a new fact that is not tied to anything personally for you. So this is a reason that cognitive dissonance is vastly uncomfortable. If you don't know, cognitive dissonance is basically the tension that's created when pieces of our mental world just stop fitting together and it comes apart and it's not so neat, in our mind. So for instance, you say, I'm a good person, or you believe that, and then you do something cruel. Or maybe you're intelligent, but then you were deceived. Maybe you see someone as independent-minded, but then they suddenly adopt an opinion mostly because everyone around them believed it. And so now they're just someone that jumped on this bandwagon. So just as, common examples. But something has to give. That's the whole point with cognitive dissonance. Sometimes we revise the belief, but more often than not, we like to revise reality. We do things like we'll minimize or maybe reinterpret the situation or come up with exceptions, behavior that would have seemed unforgivable from somebody else is now understandable, only though when the person doing it is somebody that we align with or identify with. This is particularly obvious in politics. So let's just a very easy, straightforward one, the war that we're currently in with Iran. So Trump, if you remember, spent years criticizing these stupid wars, and ending these endless foreign wars was a whole part of his America First campaign. And now that the U.S. is at war with Iran, which is a war of choice and completely unnecessary, many of his strongest supporters are still defending this. And none of these people seem to remember that his campaign in 2024 was all about the antithesis of this. And so all the people who are still allied with him have suddenly acted like the war is a good idea, and not at all, in complete contradiction with everything he ran on that they supported. And, maybe they have good reasons, but if you listen to these people, you could just see them fumbling, trying to justify it. And so, if it was a president they hated, would they still make the same decision? Would they still support this war? No, obviously not. A politician from the opposing party changes positions and we're quick to call it hypocrisy. But if it's someone we agree with or from our side or party or whatever you want to call it, changing position somehow is viewed differently. It's not hypocrisy anymore. It's now a sign of growth, Or let's say someone that you're opposed to insults somebody else. You see this as cruel. That person's hateful. They're a bad person. But if it's someone that you like, you align with, you respect, you're more likely to see it as, rather than being cruel or, a sign of, like a negative character trait. You're like, oh, that's refreshingly candid. They're just honest. But sometimes the circumstances genuinely are different. So that's what makes the motivated reasoning difficult to detect. The argument itself doesn't have to be false because you can reach a correct conclusion for self-serving reasons, right? You can also reach a terrible conclusion through impeccable-looking reasoning because you selected the evidence, you selected the assumptions and standards and so on and so forth that made your preferred answer inevitable. So it's not like there's this cognitive or I guess cognizant action when you suddenly say to yourself, okay, I'm about to rationalize. I am in this objective state of enlightenment. That would be obviously way easier instead rationalization tends to feel exactly like reasoning. And why is this? Because you're experiencing yourself as in this state of thinking, you're producing evidence, making distinctions, formulating conclusions. So subjectively, it may feel, and oftentimes does feel, no different from an honest attempt to figure something out. And that is sort of where intelligence becomes especially, I guess, interesting, for lack of a better word. So the more cognitively sophisticated a person is, the more material they have available for, let's say, for constructing explanations. Knowing things, knowledge gives you more facts. Education should, give you more concepts that you can then connect to other things. Verbal ability, like I said, is extremely important for having good rhetoric, using effective persuasive skills and language. Experience itself gives you more examples to draw upon, but those things don't necessarily dictate how you use them. A highly educated person can use knowledge to challenge their own assumptions, or they can use it to build more elaborate fortifications around them. Credentials, therefore, as I will always say, and I said in my last episode and probably before that, credentials don't make us invincible against foolishness. Unfortunately, we would have saved ourselves several thousand years of trouble and repeating the same, cyclical patterns that aren't helpful. This is also why expertise does create a particular vulnerability. The more knowledge that we have, or the more knowledgeable that we become in some area, the more justified we are in trusting our own judgment within that area, and sometimes beyond that, right? We see that all the time. That confidence can be deserved, and oftentimes is, but it can and does spill over. Being an expert on one thing doesn't confer expertise on everything touching it. And even when people have genuine expertise, that doesn't eliminate the emotional investment. Scientists, for instance, they become attached to a theory, sometimes for, a theory that they've held for a very long time. That's part of their whole career. Philosophers, my favorite, obviously, create these wonderfully complex, exquisite systems explaining human existence, and then they're just like absolute disasters or catastrophes at being people in their own life. And I'm not going to name names because there's many of them. There's many of these people, and I'm guilty of this too. Remember, we're not static beings. We're dynamic. So at any given time, we can be and will act foolishly. And then in the same way, we can be, we can be wise and deliver wisdom and objectivity and, act in sort of this more objective or ethical framework. But we're not AI robots, right? We don't wander around independently through the forest, or wherever, just, offering up these scientific theories to nobody. We're social creatures, right? And we operate in groups, and groups reward certain arguments. They reward loyalty, people who can articulate the group's position effectively. Somebody who can just annihilate an opponent's argument publicly, that's why we live for a good debate. But the smarter defender of the tribe or group can bring status even if the tribe itself is wrong. We see that all the time. Just look at cults for a very simple example. So reasoning has always had this sort of social function, in addition to sort of, what's the word? Epistemic one, I guess I could say. Sometimes we reason to understand, to persuade, to defend ourselves, or to signal to others that we belong. like, hey, I'm one of you. And those objectives can cause a great deal of conflict. So, for instance, if changing my mind moves me closer to truth, but further from literally every single person I love or care about, truth suddenly is the competition, right? Or it has competition. It feels threatening. That doesn't mean that people are cowardly or stupid for caring about belonging, because belonging is it's literally one of the most powerful human motives that we have. Whether or not we want to admit it is something it's entirely different. But being rejected from a community is devastating for people and often has devastating consequences unless you have, and that's something that you care about, right? Unless you have antisocial personality disorder, which, that just means AKA you're a sociopath or psychopath. But some common examples of the non-psychopaths, I guess, is, most of you watching this, think of how often you see someone, or maybe this is your own experience, but those who grew up, for instance, in deeply religious families or communities and began questioning the religion. Those are major social factors to consider. There's a lot at stake there. It's not just some distant thought experiment. It's this question involves your entire life and everybody around you, and everything that you've known. Your entire social world revolves around this. Same with political ideologies. Changing your views can alter your friendships, professional standing, or professional relationships. It can ruin your reputation, or your whole career. So there's major tangible consequences. So when somebody stubbornly defends an obvious, from other people's viewpoints, it's obviously a shaky belief, think about why they're doing it. What is this belief holding together for them? The argument on the surface is maybe not the real argument. This is what Nietzsche understood so well about philosophy. He was really suspicious of philosophers who would present their systems as though they had simply followed pure reason, to this inevitable conclusion. He thought philosophy often revealed something about the philosopher, which I fully agree with. And those things, for instance, temperament, values, instincts, desires. In other words, we may believe, and we often do, we're constructing an argument while simultaneously revealing ourselves through the argument that we constructed. And Dostoevsky, one of my favorite writers, he deeply understood something related to, Nietzsche, but a little bit differently. And that's through his characters. His characters are constantly demonstrating that a human being is not a rational calculator, right? People in his books are just constantly sabotaging themselves. They cling to suffering. They act vastly against their own interests. And then so they choose irrationality. And so as a result of being human, they have to then come up with explanations for what they've done. Reason often arrives sort of after the desire. Their, personal desires have already won. Reason is one of the best instruments that we have for correcting error. That's true. But an instrument can only be as good as the way that we use it. Does that make sense? So a microscope can help you see things that are otherwise invisible to the naked eye, but it doesn't force you to look at the thing you would rather not see. That part remains our problem as humans. So what actually distinguishes intellectual honesty then from merely being intelligent? I think one important distinction is the ability to become suspicious of an argument precisely when you find it emotionally satisfying. It sounds kind of backwards, but usually when an explanation fits perfectly with everything we already believe, we experience this sort of relief, right? There it is. It's evidence, it's vindication. The annoying, irritating people that we hate, those fucking retards, they were wrong again. Ha ha ha. But that may be exactly the moment to be a little bit more careful and cautious, right? Not because the conclusion must be false, but because you have discovered a conclusion that you're strongly motivated to accept. So when information flatters your ego in some way, whether it's, your political beliefs, or it confirms your opinion of somebody that you already dislike, it vindicates or validates your existing worldview or proves that the decision you already made was correct, the evidentiary bar should probably go up rather than down, right? But, the same applies in reverse. If a piece of information instantly makes you angry because it threatens something you believe, it elicits a strong emotional reaction, it doesn't prove that the information is correct either, but it tells you that neutral evaluation has become a little bit harder. A lot harder, I should say. Remember Socrates? I talk about him all the time. He's not remembered for producing like a huge catalog of correct answers about everything, but people remember him mainly because of his advice to consider that we need to be careful when we're so certain about something and that we should be intellectually humble. So there is a wisdom to acknowledging that you could know a lot, but you probably still don't know most things. Curiosity, genuine curiosity is what matters. And there's a difference between defensiveness and curiosity. When you're defensive, you're asking, how can I prove this wrong? With curiosity, instead you're like, well, what if this is right? There's a big distinction. When you're feeling or allowing defensiveness to start to override objectivity or just mere curiosity, we are automatically looking for the weakest version of the opposing argument. We're just like, we're out there, we're ready, we're just on the defense, we're ready to fight. Curiosity, however, is different. It allows us to remain open to other possibilities, to seeking information from the opposition. With defensiveness, we're looking for every inconsistency to an opposing argument. But then when we're curious, when we're open, we're more interested. When we recognize or can see the same inconsistency maybe on our own side or in our own beliefs or viewpoints. So I guess what I'm trying to say is what's important is that curiosity, when it's not overpowered by the ego, it lets us kind of sit comfortably with the question and have it remain ambiguous or unanswered. That's something you guys should try and keep in mind. When you stop and ask whether you're in a state of defensiveness, usually driven, and it's always ego driven, I should say. I hate saying always or never, though. It's like a rule I have. It feels weird. But if it's accompanied by a strong emotional tug, notice how curiosity, when we feel curious, it doesn't fuel that same sort of adrenal system. Curiosity finds us in this more relaxed state, both physically and mentally. Or rather, you could say that feeling relaxed or open finds us in a more curious state. Emotions drive thoughts and vice versa. But why do we prefer to have questions answered? Because, like I will say throughout this podcast, and it's probably going to get annoying, but humans, we need certainty. We crave it. like a drug. It feels good. Ambiguity is uncomfortable because any question that's unresolved or unclear, it creates this tension. We desire closure. We want to know what happened. We want to know what happened, who is right, what kind of person somebody is, where, like, what box we can shove them into, which ideology explains the problem, which one is the problem. Sometimes there simply is not enough information yet. But saying I don't know provides it's like it has zero psychological reward. A doctor, let's say, that tells you, well, it's complicated, it's tough to say, it depends, or whatever other combination of words we hate hearing that basically just communicates uncertainty. How many arguments are won with phrases like, I don't know? None. Ironically, though, that's the only absolute answer. I guess the second one, maybe, that I've given you this entire episode. When people fall in that middle, uncertainty, or it's complicated, depends. Have you guys ever noticed how those people aren't the ones that attract the most attention? They don't have the most views. They are not the most popular. I mean, how many people can you think of that have gone viral for saying things like, I've considered several possibilities and I remain insufficiently informed? That is a terrible methodology if your goal is views or virality. And as I'm saying this, I'm perhaps digging my own grave because this show may offer, insight or different ways to think and view your own behaviors, existence, etc., and that of others. But it's not going to give you a whole lot of certainty or, these black and white absolute responses to questions. I'm okay with that because I think it's more intellectually responsible to say that, after careful consideration, I'm not sure, or I see that this is maybe more complicated than I initially thought. How do we know when we are reasoning and then when we're rationalizing? I think we probably can't know with certainty. Once again, I know. These are the fun contradictions and paradoxes of being a human, right? But think about it like the machinery that's doing the inspection is the same machinery under investigation, which is inconvenient. But you can sort of ask yourself questions that make self-deception harder so that you can identify when you might be deceiving yourself. So one question is, would I accept this argument if it supported the opposite conclusion? If somebody I dislike did exactly what the person I support just did, would I describe it in the same way? Would I feel the same way? Am I searching for information that could prove me wrong, or only information that helps me explain that I'm right? It's a good one. And maybe the most uncomfortable one would be what would it cost me to change my mind? And we're not talking about changing the mind intellectually, remember, but personally, because the cost is always often tied to questions of status, whether or not someone or many people would be disappointed. Would you have to admit to being wrong or take some sort of accountability in some way, whether it's in the form of an apology or whatever? We might feel that our entire sense of self or who we are is now at risk or under investigation. These costs, very personal to us, don't prove that the belief is false, but they reveal where that motivated reasoning has something to work with. And I think that that's probably the real danger in being intelligent. Not that intelligence causes irrationality. That's not at all what I'm saying, okay? It doesn't. But intelligence can make irrationality harder to recognize because the resulting explanations that we provide, it's sophisticated enough to satisfy others and, more importantly, to outsmart our own selves. Remember this, guys, that the foolish person often doesn't actually sound foolish. They can be sharp, articulate, funny, well-read, educated, persuasive, have good rhetoric, confident, and other things that make a person seem attractive and credible. Sometimes the smartest person in the room is also the most capable when it comes to constructing airtight arguments for, why they could not possibly be the fool. Which is probably why the safest assumption is that none of us are above this problem. You can't just read enough books to where suddenly you're immune from self-deception. You just become self-deceived with better acuity than others. So basically, it's harder to even detect at that point. So the goal then, it's not to stop having convictions. That would be impossible and probably not desirable. The goal should be instead to hold your convictions in a way that leaves open the possibility of revision. Remember that last episode? Allow your convictions to be open to revision. And we should focus, I think, on caring more about whether an idea survives scrutiny than whether we personally survive the argument just looking clever. And remember that the ability to defeat someone else in a debate says very little, doesn't say much about whether we have defeated our own biases. So the question I want to leave you with is think about what belief for you would be hardest to change, not because the evidence against it is weak, but because changing it would cost you something personally, whether it's a relationship, a political identity, maybe embarrassment, a previous judgment that you made about somebody, or even just a theory that you have held for a long time about yourself. And if you can't think of anything, congratulations, I guess, or maybe you should look into that because that would be kind of strange. I can't know for sure, but you can and do. But we're out of time and I want to end there. I'm Megan Alexis, and this has been Will to Folly. Thank you guys for spending some of your precious finite time here with me. Until the next episode, remember, you're going to die in the end. I'm going to die. We're all going to die. So just try and pull yourself together a little bit. Don't get your panties in a bunch. Don't sweat the small stuff. Get off your phone. Go read a book. Go outside. Try to get one of your ducks in a row. Time is ticking. Okay? You don't have all the time in the world. But I will see you next time. Have a great day. Bye, guys.